be human rights in the global world, a critical perspective. And with that session, we have a very known speaker, Dr. Chandra Muzaffar, who has long been an activist, a thinker, a political scientist, a critical human rights activist who champions the human rights issues as well as exposing what I think he called it the human wrongs. I think in one of the conferences back in the 90s or 80s. He's also the president of International Movements for a Just World. Before I start, I'll pass the mic to Chandra Muzaffar. I wanted to express my gratitude and honor to be chairing the sessions because I was a big fan of him when I am a big fan of him and read his writings when I was in high school. I still remember the words Hegemony Ethics or Hegemony Global, I think. Global Ethics, yes. So that's my introductions into politics when I was in high school. And it's something that I remember till even today. So without further ado, I would like to pass the sessions to Dr. Chandra.
Thank you, Dan. Imran. Sorry, I was not here yesterday. Yeah? Sorry for that lapse. Thank you, Imran. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Saudara Dr. Ahmad Farouk, distinguished speakers, IRF staff, Shuaib, and others, friends. Assalamu alaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Salam Sejahtera, peace be with you. Let me begin by thanking IRF, an organization that we have worked with very often, an organization which does Malaysia and Southeast Asia proud by its numerous activities and its commitment to the cause of a progressive Islam. Thank you very much for this invitation. The topic that has been given to me, human rights in the global world, a critical perspective, is a topic which is seldom discussed in human rights circles, because this is an attempt to look at human rights from a global perspective, not from the perspective of individual nation states. In other words, we're not looking at human rights in the context of Malaysia or Indonesia or Singapore. We're looking at it from a global perspective. And if you see it from a global perspective, there are, I think, at least two trends. I shall present those two trends, a minor trend and a major trend, and concentrate upon the major trend in human rights at the global level. In other words, looking at human rights within the global system, which is what one is going to try to do this morning. Now let me begin with a minor trend. Human rights is seen from a global perspective. And what's the minor trend? The minor trend is the articulation of human rights ideals through various human rights declarations, conventions, protocols, laws, and so on. That's the minor trend. The most significant of these minor trends would, of course, be the Universal Declaration of Human Rights of 1948, which everyone has heard of. 1948, it is a declaration. It has no force of enforcement behind it. It's something that you can't enforce, but nonetheless, it is a very important document in terms of its moral suasion. It's moral suasion. It's an important document, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And since 1948, there have been numerous other conventions and agreements, protocols, laws, and so on. Many of them you will be aware of. There was the Convention on Civil and Political Rights, 1966. the Convention on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, also in 1966, both ratified in 1976. Then we have, of course, the Declaration Against Racial Discrimination, the Declaration Against Torture, the Declaration on behalf of women, the rights of women, the Declaration on behalf of children, the rights of children, and one can go on and on. A number of these documents. They represent what I call the idealistic dimension of human rights in the global system, the idealistic dimension, where you articulate what is essentially an idealistic position, which is very important, necessary, vital, that this is what the world should be like. That's what these declarations and conventions tell us. This is what we want. This is what we would like to aspire towards, something we want to struggle for. But friends, there is yet another trend. And what is this other trend? It is a certain approach to international affairs, to relations between peoples, dictated to a great extent by power. That's the other dimension, by power. By the realities of power, if you will. By concerns which center around power. And that has been a reality with us for a long, long while. Relations between communities and nations, relations between individuals, even between a husband and wife. Power plays a very big role, right? We all know that. Parents, children, power. And the dictum that might is right, that dictum, might is right, has played a major role in shaping relations between societies, between states and individuals. It's in fact the major dictum in the study of bilateral, multilateral ties and so on. I'm going to concentrate upon this and the consequences of this particular major trend when you look at human rights from a global perspective. Very quickly, and we cannot spend too much time on this because this is something which has been documented and people are aware of this, but I'm putting it in a particular perspective. Go back to what happened to the indigenous peoples of the Americas, the indigenous peoples of Australasia, and in certain other parts of the world, the indigenous communities, which had their own ways of organizing themselves. But in the case of the Americas, we know that they were almost wiped out completely by people, those who came from Europe, who professed to believe in human rights. Even at that time, this was beginning, their so-called concern for human rights. But when it came to these people, the inhabitants of the Americas, and of course, we also saw the same thing in Australia and New Zealand, these were not human beings, in a sense. They were people that could be annihilated, that could be wiped out. Many, a very big portion were killed in wars, others were killed as a result of the deliberate spread of diseases that were spread amongst these people. We are very much aware of this. Some people say the figure could be, in the case of the Americas, North and South America, it could range between 50 and 70 million, which is huge. 50 and 70 million were wiped out in different ways over a period of time, of course. It was the Holocaust, without any doubt at all, of the indigenous peoples. And the same thing in Australasia, that is both Australia and New Zealand, except in New Zealand there was resistance. And it was organized resistance which forced the whites who came to New Zealand to agree to a treaty, the Waitangi Treaty of 1840, where they had to recognize the rights of the Maoris in some areas. But Australia, it was worse, much, much worse, partly because they were not as well organized and they were just wiped out. And you know, we talk of human rights in Australia, as far as the law was concerned, for a very long while, the First Peoples of Australia were not regarded as human beings. They were placed in the same category as kangaroos. And killing them was often projected as killing kangaroos. In other words, human beings like you and I, but they were not viewed as human beings by the conquerors from outside. So this was the tragedy that people had undergone and others in other parts of the world, but something which is not highlighted when we talk about the history of human rights. We should, whenever we talk of the history of human rights, we should begin with stories, with narratives of this sort, because this is what had happened. And then you had the colonial epoch, long period, few centuries, Western colonialism, though there were other forms of colonialism, but Western colonialism was unique in many respects. Western colonialism also resulted in the annihilation of millions of people. The figure that is often cited is 40 million, who died in different colonies, in different parts of the colonized world, stretching from Latin America, which is colonized, as you know, by white nations, to Africa, to Asia. A total of about 40 million were wiped out. And of course, these were people, cultures that were enslaved, dominated, their own indigenous systems were set aside, and this was, without any doubt at all, one of the great wrongs done in human history, colonialism, from a human rights perspective, which is why when we held this conference here in Kuala Lumpur in 1994, in December 1994, we called it human wrongs. It was human wrongs. And we had papers from very good people from different parts of the world. And it's a book. It's published as a book called Human Wrongs. So the point one is making is, colonialism is yet another example of the dehumanization of a big segment of the human race. Deprivation of rights, all the rights that they had talked about, all the rights that they had preached, political, civil, economic, social, cultural, every one of those. But people were deprived of this. People were killed. Because the ultimate human right is the right to live. That is the ultimate human right, the right to live. And if you cannot recognize that, and you wipe out people, what does it mean? And that was the colonial epoch. Post-colonial epoch, don't think things had ended. In terms of domination and control, it has continued. And that's the reality which some of us don't even recognize. That's the reality that confronts us today. I mean, if you look at it again in terms of what had happened to people, to human beings with their lives, look at what had happened in our part of the world for a start, Northeast and Southeast Asia. The Korean War was about the politics of dominance. And thousands of people were killed. Many of the issues related to that war have still not been accounted for. And technically, the war had not ended because the Korean War technically was not brought to a close. Then we had, if you look at it chronologically, in our part of the world, what happened in Indonesia? What happened in Indonesia? 1965, Gestapo. That crisis that led to the annihilation of perhaps close to 1 million people according to certain sources. It was political, it was linked to dominance and hegemony, because the US in particular was very concerned about the direction of Indonesian politics at that time. They felt that the communists would gain the upper hand. You know, the third biggest communist party in the world in Indonesia, PKI, at that time, Partai Komunis Indonesia, third biggest after the Soviet Union and China. It was very powerful, influential, but it was not the dominant force. The dominant force, all said and done, was still the nationalist element around Sukarno. But they didn't like Sukarno, because Sukarno was independent-minded. He was a man who believed that he and his people must be the masters of their own destiny. And this is what the US was not happy with. And they engineered that famous coup on the 30th of September 1965. And after the coup, of course, the mass killings that took place in various parts of Indonesia, particularly in Jalan. 1 million killed. Those who were on the other side, or who were supposed to be on the other side, a lot of innocent people were also killed. And unfortunately, as it happens sometimes, and Indonesia is perhaps an example of this, quite a lot of Chinese Indonesians were killed. So that's Indonesia. Then, chronologically, you have Vietnam, in our part of the world, what had happened in Vietnam. Again, a war which was basically an attempt to crush a nationalist movement. It so happened that the party that led the nationalist movement was communist. Ho Chi Minh was a communist leader, yes, but he was basically a nationalist who wanted to free his country from first French rule and then dominance that followed French rule. After the French were defeated, he and his supporters defeated the French in 1954, and then of course the Americans moved in and they started controlling Vietnam and Indochina. And there was this war of resistance. And we know that 3 million died in the Vietnamese, 3 million. Of course, American soldiers and allies and so on, about 50,000, perhaps 60,000 were killed. But 3 million Vietnamese died, an additional 1 million Cambodians and Laotians, because when the war extended to those two neighboring countries, they were also killed. And if you look at the tragedy about this, US intervention and the killings that took place, the carpet bombing of Vietnam, which is so famous, Agent Orange, or the rest of it, right? It began on a false pretext. I often quote this example when I talk about false flag operations. The argument used by those who wanted to go to war in the United States of America at that time, the president was Johnson, Lyndon Johnson. He wanted to escalate the involvement. It began under Kennedy, actually, the involvement, but it was escalated by Johnson. Now, the excuse used was that Vietnamese boats were targeting American planes, shooting at American planes over the Gulf of Tonkin. The Gulf of Tonkin, in the northern part of Vietnam. It was not true. It was false. It was a lie. But that lie was presented as a resolution of the US Congress. And the US Congress approved. This was a war resolution. Approved the decision to go to war. Because the US was under attack. It was not true. They decided to go to war. And then began the carpet bombing of Vietnam. That's just our part of the world. Yeah? And if you very quickly look at other parts of the world, West Asia, we know that this tragedy related to post-colonial control and dominance, it started with Palestine. Palestine is an issue linked to colonialism, because it was something that was created by groups that were very much part of colonial Europe at that time. The so-called Zionists, they were great supporters of colonialism, Theodore Herzl and other people. And in the end, of course, they succeeded in creating this artificial state called Israel in 1948, at the expense of the Palestinian people, the Arabs. They were pushed out of their land, Deir Yassin and other episodes. Thousands were killed, others expelled, and this was the beginning of the great Palestinian catastrophe, what they call the Nakba, their suffering, the Palestinians. And that has gone on. There is no solution in sight at the moment. But there have been other tragedies in that region. I would regard the Iraq war as yet another tragedy, a war that should not have happened. As the late Edward Said described it, this is a very well-known scholar, public intellectual, died a few years ago. Edward Said described the Iraq war as the most immoral war in history. The most immoral war in history. Because the whole thing was, again, based on false premises. That Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction, which was not true, and they knew it was not true. And they used that as an excuse to invade and occupy Iraq, both the United States and Britain. This is why I always call it an Anglo-American war, not just the United States. The British played a big role in pushing for that. And again, in terms of casualties, perhaps 1 million people have died in Iraq, not just Iraqis but others. Also, the invaders, the casualties have been recorded, of course much, much less compared to the Iraqi side, but 1 million Iraqis, the victims of that war. And that's not the end of the story as far as that region is concerned. Arising from Iraq and linked to the Iraq war would be what happened in Syria. Because they created the conditions that led to the crisis in Syria. And then of course they wanted to get rid of the government of Bashar al-Assad in Damascus, and they wanted to break up that alliance between Bashar al-Assad and the Hezbollah and Iran, the three-way link, which they saw as the most formidable resistance to their dominance. And that tragedy had gone on for a long while. We know officially, formally, the Western powers and their allies in the region, Israel and Saudi Arabia, have actually lost. But nonetheless, the sacrifice was huge. Hundreds of thousands. They had to leave their homes, and casualties easily more than 500,000 dead. And then Libya, again related to that. It's part of that so-called Arab uprisings and, the changes that they wanted to bring about in that region, what Condoleezza Rice called in 2006 the New Middle East. And here again, New Middle East meant getting rid of people like Muammar Gaddafi. And again, you remember all those lies that, he had massacred 100,000 people. After the thing was over, after Gaddafi was killed, people asked where are the 100,000 graves. It's supposed to have killed 100,000 people, which was again one of those lies that they put out. And an academic played a big role in this. Something that academics should not be proud of. This is the French academic by the name of Bernard Lévy, who was the one who urged the French president at that time, Sarkozy, to go to war in Libya, to overthrow Gaddafi. Bernard Lévy is known as a staunch Zionist, and the Zionists, like in the case of Iraq, they're very much part of that war also in Libya. I say the Zionists have played a very big role, and this is a point that one has to keep in mind, that when you talk about the global forces at work, wanting control, dominance, the Zionists and the State of Israel, they've been very much in the forefront. And why? Because they see this dominance related to the United States of America as critical for their own survival. They feel that they have to ensure that the US continues to dominate the world so that they would be able to dominate West Asia. Without US support, they would not be able to dominate West Asia. The wars that they want fought in that region have been fought by the Americans on their behalf, whether it's in Iraq or in Syria against the poor people of Yemen. These are things which they have been pushing for. And this has been their game plan. So you have to consider that dimension too. But this is just West Asia. Don't forget that if you look at West Asia, a little beyond West Asia, North Africa and the whole of Africa, same problem of dominance, control, thousands, millions killed. The Algerian War, not the Americans, but the French. Another imperial power. Another imperial power. You know, the three greatest imperial powers that we have to contend with are the United States, Britain, and France. So the French, the case of Algeria, and then of course Mali, Chad, states like the Ivory Coast and so on, they've got their interests. And we have had, of course, the great tragedy of the Congo. Don't forget the Congo tragedy. And here it was the Belgians. You know, they were about to leave, but they wanted to continue to control the Congo. And they had, of course, the United States and others supporting them. And that led to the Civil War. Thousands and thousands were killed in that Civil War. And the great patriot, I mention his name whenever I can, Patrice Lumumba. He was a nationalist, a man committed to his people. He was appalled by the fact that at the time of the departure of the Belgians from the Congo, there were only 17 persons in the whole of the Congo who had tertiary education. They had bled the Congo white through their dominance and their control, because it was a rich country, you know, in terms of minerals and everything that you can think of. And the poor man, Patrice Lumumba, because he resisted, he paid the price. He was killed. Lumumba was killed. And then, of course, we have the symbolic manifestation of white dominance in South Africa. Don't forget apartheid, a system which had evolved over the centuries but became very powerful after 1948, the apartheid system in South Africa. And a lot of people oppressed, marginalized, the blacks, other colored people, and the rest of it. That's the story of Africa, which has not ended, it has continued, as far as Western dominance is concerned. And then you have, of course, the United States backyard. Don't forget this. Very often, many of us, and I say this in all frankness, in the Muslim world, whenever we talk about Western dominance, about the struggles, the sufferings of the people, we forget what is happening in Latin America. There are very few Muslims in Latin America, which goes to show the phenomenon we are talking about is not related to religion per se. It is dominance and control and what it does to people. Latin America, ever since the Monroe Doctrine, which I'm sure many of you have heard of, 1823, the Monroe Doctrine, that established that the United States would be the sole power controlling, basically, the countries of Central and South America. And that's what they've tried to do since the Monroe Doctrine. And we've had numerous cases. Central America, Panama, Nicaragua. We have had Guatemala, cases of that sort, and so many other examples. Argentina, Chile. Don't forget what had happened to a brave, principled president of Chile. This is Salvador Allende, who was overthrown on the 11th of September 1973 by Henry Kissinger and his friends, because they could not stand the fact that he was independent-minded. He was supposed to be Marxist in terms of his ideology, but again, essentially a person who wanted an independent nation-state and nation-state which would control its own resources. They were not prepared to accept that. And there have been other cases. Well, of course, the most famous example of the desire to control and the resistance of a people and a leadership would be Cuba in Latin America. Cuba was their playground before 1959, the playground of the United States of America and the West, in a sense. Beautiful island, and they thought they could do what they wanted. And then there was a People's Uprising, led by Fidel Castro, and at that time, Che Guevara, and others were part of the Cuban Revolution. They established an independent government, which at the beginning was very determined to emphasize that it was not going to go Marxist at the beginning, which is why they called it the olive green revolution. They wanted it to be different. But the US, simply because it was going to be independent, they applied a lot of pressure, and eventually they forced Cuba into the hands of the Soviet Union, because Cuba had to protect itself in that very difficult situation. But Cuba, in spite of all the attempts, no leader in human history has been the target of assassination attempts more than Fidel Castro. Numerous times, even through his cigar, they tried to kill him. But for some reason, I suppose this is where divine protection comes in. He was not killed that way. He died of old age. Amazing, amazing. They just tried to wipe him out. And, well, of course, they did other terrible things. You know about the plane, again, not highlighted at all. A Cuban airliner, which was destroyed in flight. A lot of the passengers were actually children. School children who had taken part in some tournament somewhere else in Latin America, and that plane was destroyed by one of the agents as part of this attempt to crush Cuba. So the story I'm trying to narrate here, and you should read about this, the numerous books, very well written by a lot of people from different parts of the world, including, and you should not be surprised, many of the finest critiques of US power have been Americans themselves, have been American scholars and intellectuals. Read those things and you'll get a clearer picture. And nowadays, of course, many of these things are on video, and you can access YouTube versions of what had happened in the past. But we must not forget this. This is our memory, our collective memory as people in the non-Western world. We should not forget this. We should remember what had happened, because it's so closely linked to what we all talk about, everyone, including those who are the oppressors of the people in the global south. They all talk about human rights. We all talk about human rights, right? But this is directly connected with those rights, the most basic of them, the right to live, the right to be free of torture, the right to be free of slavery, in a sense. Friends, this is the backdrop. The good news is that power is losing its grip. It's losing its grip. There's no doubt about it. It's changing. The world is changing. We are now getting into a situation where other centers of power have emerged, and other centers of power are impacting upon world trade, the world economy, they're impacting upon world politics, world culture. That's a major change. China, Russia, the reassertion of Russia. Once a military power, but now reasserting itself. Today, in terms of military technology, though this is something which I personally am not thrilled about, but military, Russia in many vital areas surpasses the US. Their military power. Economic power, China. These are vital dimensions of power. And one can argue, and sometimes I do this tongue-in-cheek, that even culturally, I think the Koreans have done very well in terms of their cultural power. It's spread everywhere. It's just amazing what the Koreans have achieved, right? The impact of Korean pop culture. So things are changing. There is a shift that is taking place. It is partly because this happens, these cycles in history, new centers of power have emerged. And once you have economic power and you've got scientific power to go along with it, because it's science that is related to economic power. And the Chinese have shown today the close link between science and economic power. You look at a lot of the scientific papers that are produced, look at some of the cutting edge technologies, the Chinese are way ahead of even the United States of America. So there's a change. Economic power backed by scientific power, there's a change in terms of certain aspects of global politics, culture. No one is saying that the United States is down in the doldrums. I'm not saying that. The United States is still very important. It is a very important nation. And the West is important, even today, in spite of what has happened. But a change is taking place. There's a shift that is taking place. You may want to ask at this point, why this great desire for power, wanting to control? Of course, power in itself is seductive. It is attractive. One wants to have power. Control the seas, control the skies. Yeah. As one American analyst put it, it is control from the bottom of the ocean to the far reaches of the galaxy. That's the control that one desires in order to control the rest of humankind. So power is a factor in itself. But in addition to that, resources, actual resources, oil, gas. Now, oil is so vital for industrial civilization. And yet, most of that oil that drives industrial civilization is not in the hands of the United States or the Western countries. They are in other lands. Quite a few of those lands are Muslim. So you have to control oil. You have to control gas. And that's what they're trying to do. So that's part of the story. And then routes, actual trade routes. You'd be surprised to learn that 8 of the 10 most important sea routes in the world. These are like the Suez Canal and Straits of Hormuz, Straits of Malacca, one of the very important routes in the world. 8 out of the 10 border Muslim countries. So control of Muslim lands becomes very important. You have to have your proxies, your agents, your puppets. You cannot control directly as in the old days, but you can control through your agents and your puppets, which is what has been happening. That's imperialism. That's dominance with another name. We use the term hegemony to describe this reality. But it is changing, as I pointed out a while ago, and it is this change that I want to address in the last part of my presentation. I think we should see this as a great opportunity. It's a great opportunity to bring about the changes that we would like to see in the world. Everyone, I'm not just talking about Muslims, because this is a global challenge. And Muslims must think beyond their own community. It's collective. One has to work together with everyone to bring about this change. A change which, to my mind, would give real meaning to human dignity. That's what we should aim for. Not just to end hegemony. That's just one dimension of the change we want. It is something that must lead to something bigger and greater, more meaningful. And that which is more meaningful is human dignity, justice for people everywhere. That should be our goal. Could I suggest, friends, that in this struggle we may want to relook at human rights itself, in trying to do something that is more meaningful for the future. Human rights, yes, it has been very important in terms of asserting the dignity of people, without any doubt at all, against the state. And it will always be important. But when I say that we have to reconceptualize human rights, what do I mean? Is there anything from our philosophies, from Islam as a philosophy, from other philosophies, Buddhism, Hinduism, Christianity, Judaism, and the other philosophies, that offers insights into the change that we want to see? I think there is. I think there is. And we should try to explore this as a way of articulating our vision of a different world, a better world, a more just world. I would like to suggest, as I've done many times before, Dr. Farooq, I'm sure, is familiar with what I'm about to say. I've suggested many times before that we have to emphasize human responsibilities. We have to emphasize human responsibilities. Rights emanate from responsibilities. We have to understand that. It is wrong to see rights as something which are divorced from responsibilities. In fact, it's responsibilities that must precede rights. Let me give you a very concrete example that all of us would be able to empathize with. We talk about the importance of a clean environment, clean water, fresh air. These things are important. But these are rights. We present them as rights, and we have a right to clean water, fresh air, whatever. We present them as rights, but these rights are only possible if we exercise our responsibilities. Otherwise, these rights will not be realities. We have to understand that we have a responsibility to look after our environment. And that must precede the rights that we want to enjoy. And that goes to everything else. Freedom of expression, freedom of speech, very important right, but it must emerge from a sense of deep responsibility. I speak up because I know that this is true. I know that this is just. Therefore, I exercise my responsibility, my duty to myself and my fellow human beings. I see it as something which I cannot forsake. I cannot abandon this duty. Out of that comes my right. And that goes for many other things. The right to assemble. You exercise that right because you feel responsible for whatever is happening in your society, some wrongdoing, you want to correct it, you get together, you protest. That's your sense of responsibility. So it is this sense of responsibility, something which we come across in Surah Al-Imran, verse 104, right? Have amongst you a group of people who will uphold what is right and forbid what is wrong. Translation, a rough translation of that concept. I think that is what we have to emphasize. Responsibility. This is why in the Quran, as in the other great spiritual texts, it is the sense of responsibility, duty to do what is right that is emphasized, and your rights will emerge from that. Exercise one's responsibility first. And I think exercising that responsibility is also tied to something so fundamental in all the great moral and spiritual traditions. It is a way of defining yourself. You exercise your responsibility because that is fundamental to your definition as a human being. It is your amana. It is your amana, your trust that you're fulfilling. And amana is a very, very important concept. Trust. That's the reason for your birth, for your creation. Because if you look at the story of creation in the Quran, which is just some parallel in other traditions, surely what that story tells us is about amana. That God had wanted to place this trust upon the mountains. It asked the others, they all turned it down. But man accepted it. It is a trust. So responsibility is linked to this notion of trust. And that trust defines us as human beings, what we are, why we are here. We are here with a purpose. It's not just, we are not playthings. We are not created for fun. And that purpose is your amana, your trust that you have to fulfill. Now this, and I want to conclude on this note, is the spiritual, moral revolution that we need. That we want to have a better world. I do not think that we can build a better world on the basis of existing premises. I don't think that is possible. There is something in the way in which we see ourselves and our fellow human beings and our lives and our futures. There's something in it which will not allow for a better world to emerge. There is a strong element of selfishness, self-centeredness. Some would even argue that human rights, when you fight for human rights, sometimes you may fall into the trap. It is a sort of a selfish endeavor. It's yourself in the ultimate analysis. But when you see it in terms of amana, trust, responsibility, the whole paradigm changes. The whole meaning of life, of why we are here, the human being, our human purpose, it changes. Maybe that is what we need, a massive transformation in the way in which we look at ourselves and our future. A lot of the rights that we fight for and that we will continue to fight for, they'll all be very, very legitimate. But it is reconceptualizing those rights within a different framework that changes everything. You see it in terms of a different conception of the human being. It doesn't matter who it is. It could be a person who sweeps drains. But when you sort of see that human being as someone who bears a trust like you, no difference, bears a trust. And that trust is divine. You have to fulfill the trust. Everything changes. And I suppose that is what the Quran also means, and I think it is something that you have quoted in your document, conference document. This idea in Surah 17, verse 70, of human dignity. That human dignity, which is God's gift to the human being, is related to our trust, the responsibility that we carry. And if we can reconceptualize our struggle that way, then perhaps we will be able to overcome real challenges like environmental degradation, which is related to greed and selfishness. We'll be able to overcome the problem of economic deprivation, growing gaps between rich and poor. I can't see how a human being who is selfless would be able to justify earning a few millions every month when you've got people who can't even survive on a few ringgit every day. I mean, how does one justify this? It's only because I think we cannot really empathize with the other, with people who are like us, but who are not in the same privileged position. Now, that has to change. It has to change. So this is why a different conception is so vital. And perhaps that's the path that your generation in particular, for people like me, we can talk about it, but it's something that we can't do very much about. Our struggle is more or less over. But for your generation, I think this is perhaps the path that one should reflect upon, at least reflect upon this. Thank you very much.